In 2010, 24-year-old Phoebe Handsjuk fell 12 stories down a garbage chute and died a horrific death.
Was it an accident? Or maybe it was suicide? Or possibly murder?
We're doing a full recap of Phoebe's fall on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time. Before we jump in, just a reminder to support us on Patreon.
That's patreon.com/so much crime, so little time.
If you check out our Patreon, you'll see all kinds of fun stuff, including bonus clips, early release episodes, outtakes, and we'll also send you some free swag. So check it out, patreon.com/so much crime, so little time.
Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. And before we start, just want to give you a warning that in this episode, we're going to have spoilers for the podcast Phoebe's Fall. We're going to discuss the whole series here.
Didn't listen yet? Go check out our preview episode on the show. It's the one before this one in your feed.
You'll also find a link for Phoebe's Fall in our show notes. As a reminder, let's tell you a little bit about Phoebe's Fall. So this podcast came out in 2016. It has two hosts. There's Richard Baker and Michael Bachelard. There are 6 main episodes. Each one is about 30 minutes long. There's also a handful of mini episodes and updates that are just a few minutes long.
In our preview episode, we discussed episode 1. This went into Phoebe's death and a bit of background into Phoebe's life.
All right, Dee, you ready to discuss Phoebe's Fall?
Where do you want to start with this one, Jeff? I kind of want to ignore episode 2. So if you've something to say about episode 2, which I presume is you've quite a lot to say about it, I would like you to get it out of the way real quick.
Okay, so episode 2, we're not going to go episode by episode. Episode 2 is called The Chute, and it really gets into the whole...
I love the way you say we're not going to go episode by episode. Episode 2 is called... Sorry.
Just to get it out of the way.
Get it out of the way.
This one is called The Chute, and it is all about sort of the mechanics of what happened to Phoebe. And we alluded to this in the preview that we were worried that we were going to get more of the gruesomeness. It's all in episode 2.
Yep.
And the only thing I want to say about this one is Phoebe's grandfather, who
was a retired detective.
Yeah, I think he really went above and beyond. Like, he was convinced that this was that someone did this to Phoebe, and he went to, I feel like, pretty far to try to test the physics of what happened, bringing a couple of Phoebe's friends to see like just the mechanics of getting into the garbage chute, going to the guy who designs and builds these garbage chutes and getting like a test, like a model. That was pretty impressive, but we don't have to get into any of the gory details.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I think one of the things I thought was impressive about I suppose the podcast, because it did speak about this quite a bit, is about Phoebe's grandfather and like how much he cared and how much he did. But also things like going to the manufacturer of the chute, and they don't give much detail as to why, but he made or had a replica and allowed them to like test it out and ask questions. And I don't know, it felt very much like a community was trying to get together. Her friends came together who would have been the same build and like as athletic as she was, again, to try and test out things with the manufacturer, to test out like height, how much you would struggle without being under the influence of alcohol or sleeping pills.
Yeah.
Ambient, I think it was called.
I mean, you and I both looked at a picture of one of her friends getting into, I don't know if it was a model garbage chute, but like you can see just how small of an opening this is. And it's the type, if you haven't seen a picture of this, it's the kind of chute where the door kind of pulls down from the top and it has like a little
hatch.
It has a hatch. Yeah. And the mechanics of getting a full grown human being into this, right? Like it's designed for like a bag of trash. Or like small bags of trash. It's not really like the size of someone who to get into this would have to be very small and limber. Which
she was, from what we've heard.
Sure, but also like it does not look like an easy process.
Well, to me, it wasn't about the easy process that they discussed. Like, of course, it wasn't an easy process, but apparently she could climb on top of buildings and jump building to building. So that's not what stood out to me with this. It was the handprints that would have been left all around, and apparently they tested the chute. One of the things they did was test the chute, and in some areas around it, and they didn't find any handprints, which is weird on a communal thing. you know, the
That's
whole
a good point.
floor
Yeah.
is using it. Like, that is odd.
You'd think there'd be prints all over this thing.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, unless someone wiped out. Which actually, okay, so this actually gets to the thing that I wanted to start with, which is to step back from the whole story and ask sort of what's the point of this podcast? Like, what are we as listeners supposed to think about this? Because essentially the question at the heart of this is, was this an accident? Was it intentional on her part? Or did someone do this to her? Those are the three options that are sort of explored and presented. And I think the hosts go into some research and some detail about exploring all of those possibilities and how likely they are. They never accuse the boyfriend, who is the most likely subject if this was murder. They in fact, I think, go out of their way to
they
say...
lean into it fairly heavily, but they never accuse him, no.
Right.
Wonder why.
Sure. But what I wanted to ask you is, do you think that this podcast is trying to convince us that the boyfriend did it without ever saying it? Like, is that the central thesis of this? Like, it's a weird thesis to have because it's never said outright.
I don't think so. I do think that they leaned into the one potential person of interest and the boyfriend. But for me, the main thing was how much of a mess the investigation was. Not even from a police point of view, but police, coroner, the detectives, the paramedics on scene, Ant, his family, the friends. Nobody had any fucking cop on.
Yeah. Yeah.
None of it. Like, and I feel like that's what they were leaning into. And not only, look, we have discussed a number of times cases where the investigation has been a mess by one or multiple parties.
Right.
So that isn't unique necessarily. I feel like what is most unique about this case, and I feel like this is what the hosts, this is what the producers, this is what the central thesis was, is there was this coroner's inquest.
Yeah.
The coroner put forward the most bizarre reasoning for calling this misadventure, death by misadventure, or whatever term they used, but that's basically what they said. And it couldn't be fought. How narrow it was, like the criteria was so narrow in order to like fight, and the cost was so high to fight this. And I feel like that is what they were leaning into. And maybe not, look, Ant may not, he has never been convicted. He's never been a person of interest, apparently. But he had money by the sounds of it. His family had money and he had money. And his family had a lot of connections within the judicial system. And so that was the other side I felt that it might be leaning into, was the justice system in this case wasn't about who did it. It was about who you know and how much money you have. And I think we saw that from the follow-ups and from what happened after this podcast came out.
Right, which I wanted to talk about. Before we get to that, though, I think to jump back to one thing you said earlier about the police work. So there's a whole episode that's called Police Work. And this is actually one of the...
Do you think it should have been called Lack of Police Work?
That would have been a better title. Yeah, I mean, my notes from that is just
Poxy police work?
It's just a short list. It's didn't get the CCTV footage, didn't take photos of the apartment, didn't test the DNA that there was blood in the apartment, didn't investigate the broken glass in the apartment and where it came from. And then there was the mini episode right after that where they talk about how no time of death was established, which...
They also didn't secure the crime scene.
Right. So kind of one failure after another. Do you think this is gross incompetence? Or do you think this is Ant's family's influence? Like, do you think the police were aware of whose apartment this was, who the parents of whose apartment this was, and maybe we just treat this a little looser?
I don't know. My gut has feelings.
What are your feelings of your
I feel like if something happened, whether it was accidental or an argument or a dare gone wrong, whatever it was, whether it was an accident or this was done on purpose, I feel like he's coming from a legal background. Yeah. He sees blood and glass in his apartment, and yet he invites lots of people up. That to me is screaming, get people in, compromise the scene.
Yeah. There's a version of this story where it's sort of I feel like this is a textbook, how to get away with it, how to establish an alibi, how to cover up your tracks, how like the fact that the police come back and ask for the CCTV footage more than 48 hours after the crime when they were told that it only keeps the recording for 48 hours. So they waited, or through negligence or intentionally, just long enough to not get anything useful from that.
Yeah, but then you go back to the people not checking her pulse.
Sure.
Her signs of life. Like that, it's very hard to believe that that would have been anything other than maybe luck on the part of whoever was involved in this. The one thing that really, really got my goat, really, really
What got
bugged
your
me
goat, D?
was her trousers. Her trousers.
Oh, the jeans. Yeah.
Were around her ankles, around her knees.
They were pushed down. It's not clear exactly. Yeah.
And they did say like there was no sign of sexual assault.
Right.
But it contradicts the story that she might have put herself in the chute, because the hosts said like it's next to impossible to climb that when you're basically hopping.
I have a different theory on that. And again, I'm not a detective. I don't know these things, and I don't know exactly what happened when. But my takeaway from that was that maybe happened at the bottom of the chute.
Yeah, but it was another factor. I can't understand how the coroner heard that and thought she must have done this to herself.
No, that's baffling. On the coroner thing, my other takeaway from this is, well, there's a couple of sort of related things. First of all, I learned the term coronial law. Is that a term you knew before?
Mm-mm.
All of the stuff about coroners' inquests and coronial law and just the power of a coroner. But an interesting thing I feel like as a takeaway from this is that this story, this reporting, seemed to lead to, or this case, to improvements in the laws there, so that it made it more possible for families to pursue changing or challenges to the coroner's determination, whatever the
Yeah, well, it widened the criteria for questioning a coroner's findings, and then it also said that the finances were a blocker because it would be so expensive to question a coroner in the way that it was structured. So it just alluded to the fact that they took away some of that financial burden.
Yeah.
I don't know the ins and outs of it, but that's one of the things that it said, and I think that's such a positive, because it was so frustrating. The fact that money was the factor that had to stop her family from going any further in this.
This definitely kind of boils down to an issue of class, right? Like a story about a family that has loads of money and unlimited resources and connections, and one that seemingly doesn't.
What did you make of the snippet about Ant's sister, who a year or two after her death posted something, but the post only stayed up for 12 hours and then it was taken down?
Yeah, I have that in front of me. So the post says, there's a line in the post that says, this is Ant's sister, and it's the heading of the
who
post.
Who had been very close to Phoebe.
Yes, it's titled In Loving Memory. She posts a picture of her and Phoebe, and she says, "You and your family were let down by the justice system and those who represent it. I only hope that one day the truth will come out so that they may have some peace." That's real loaded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was, I don't know. It stinks. The whole thing stinks.
It really does. That's Chrissy is her name. Chrissy Hample. Yeah, which they know it was like the genesis of this podcast, right? Like that inspired them to pursue this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think also about the cleaner, the apartment cleaner, Shelley?
Well, I don't know if she's going to get many jobs than any other highfalutin families or in any other houses.
She really tells.
She talks a lot about her clients, doesn't she?
Yeah, what she sees, what she thinks, how she feels about the comings and goings within the apartment.
Her description of the people in the apartment after Phoebe's death, that was
She calls them grief tourists.
Junkies. Grief tourists. Is
I think
that what she said?
Maybe it was grief
tourists.
junkies. One of those.
She's like, they weren't even talking about her.
In that same episode, this is episode 5, saying goodbye. So we hear from Shelley the cleaner. We also hear something that I thought was really interesting, where the cop comes to get Ant's a report on Ant, and Ant ends up typing it for the cop. That seems like a breach of protocol, doesn't it?
Add it to the list, Jeff.
But okay, so then the other part of that I thought was really interesting was the description of the cop's description of Ant's sort of grief, where he's crying, but he's observing like, well, there's no tears or there's no mucus.
It's so funny because when he was describing that, I was like, oh, that's like my daughter when she's pretending to be upset about something. She's like, ah! But like, I'm like, there is no feeling here. I love you. You're frustrated. You are not crying.
But it's true.
Yeah.
When someone is uncontrollably sobbing and the tears and mucus are just streaming out of their face holes and
their face holes.
But seriously, like that's a real thing. I don't know why it never occurred to me. It seems as a parent, it is definitely a way to know when your children are faking it.
100%.
But as a cop, of course, the same thing is applicable. Like you can only, I mean, I guess if you're a really good actor, which is like a thing that I hear actors say, like, can you sort of cry on command? Can you make a tear come down your face on command? Which most people can't. Like, it's really hard.
There's something very pathetic about a 40-year-old man fake crying, I will say.
Yes, absolutely.
Regardless of how Phoebe died, surely you're a little bit sad.
Did it surprise you, though, on this point, when we learned how long they'd been together? It was, what, a year or two?
Yeah, that was it.
This was not a long-term relationship.
I mean, at 24, I think a 2-year relationship is fairly long.
For her, but he's, what, 40?
Do you think he has had longer relationships than that?
All right, fair enough. But they met. She fairly quickly moved in with him. Mm-hmm. It sounds like they had a very rocky relationship. But it doesn't sound like, even if there was a period of sort of bliss, that it was particularly long. It couldn't have been more than a handful of months. It seems like she was in the process of fighting with him, breaking up, getting back together, all throughout this period. Mm-hmm. It does not sound like a very healthy, lasting relationship.
I mean, I don't think there was anything healthy about it. Surely you have had friends who've been in relationships and they are obsessed. And I feels like that's what Phoebe was, because it alluded to, there was a few friends that spoke on the podcast who said we had lost touch.
Yeah.
That feels like what happens when a friend gets into a very intense, often toxic relationship. Yeah. They lose touch with their other friends because, you know, it's not good enough. It doesn't fit in the other person's life, or there's a control issue there.
Yeah, sometimes both.
I think, yeah, and I think one of there were a lot of things that shocked me, which I you know, look, this was a pretty short podcast, and there were so many bits that I was like, this is shocking. Like, I need more information on this or discussion on it, and I suppose that's what we're here to do. But even the description of the night that Ant came back, and he is supposed to go for dinner with Phoebe's dad.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Glad you brought this up.
So he gets in and she's not there, but her handbag and her purse and her phone are there. And he apparently was like, this was so weird because she never leaves without her phone and her purse. So he sits down, has a beer, has a cigarette, which I was like, you know what? If you're used to your spouse like going out in the tower, which apparently she did quite a lot, that's kind of normal. Her dad called Phoebe's phone, and apparently Phoebe's phone was not there. It was in the repair shop.
Yep.
Or with her. It was not there anyway.
It was not supposed to be there.
And a minute or two after her dad rang, and obviously nobody picked up, Ant rang her dad and said,
that's right.
Got home, Phoebe's not here, think we're going to have to cancel, etc., etc. And Ant's dad said it was so weird because he has never called me. And Ant said it must have just been a coincidence.
And then he orders takeout from that same...
But before that phone call, he ordered takeout, but from the same restaurant that they were supposed to bring her dad.
It's so bizarre.
It's a bit controlling, because it's a bit like, oh, well, in my head, I was going to eat this food tonight. So it doesn't matter what has happened between now and dinner. That is what I'm eating tonight because that is what I do.
Yeah.
I plan and I do. There is no wiggle room.
I so badly wanted Ant to be a participant in this, and the fact that he isn't only, I think, makes obviously him seem more suspicious, more sort of dodgy.
Well, especially when he's talking through his lawyer.
Right. Yeah, they try to reach out to him. The hosts try to reach out to him, and they get a response from his lawyer. But yeah, there's so many questions there about the choices he made, the things he did, the responses he had. Yeah, that moment, that whole sequence of events was so hard to understand.
So hard.
Yeah.
Do you know, Jeff, what one of the most shocking findings after this podcast is that in 2018, which is 2 years after this podcast came out, Ant Hampel broke up with a girlfriend who was 25 at the time. He was 51. And hours later, she was found dead in her apartment. And I don't know. I feel a bit sick having found that out. Jeff, have you ever been shat on by a bird?
Yes.
Has it ever happened twice but hit you in the exact same spot?
No.
That's what this stinks of right now. What are the chances?
I don't know. I don't know the other details of the story, but yeah, the fact that it happened twice and two women who were honestly about the same age look kind of similar. Yeah, don't feel great about that. So we obviously don't know anything about this. There's a lot more that's happened in the years since this podcast came out, since this story happened with Phoebe. But it's an interesting thing about listening to a podcast that happened so long ago, from a case that happened so long ago, and then more things happen in these people's lives. And yeah, it's definitely something to keep looking for news updates on.
Yeah, I feel like her mum alluded to that as well. I think it might have been in episode 1, saying, you know, while she was dealing with her grief, the world kept moving and people kept getting up and going to work. And she said, like, she was like, I just wanted to go out. I wanted to scream. How are you waking up? How are you going to get milk from the grocery store? Like, how are you doing all of this? The world can't keep spinning. My daughter has died.
Yeah.
Such a raw point to make. And I feel like anyone who's going through grief feels like that. I can only imagine if it's a child and if they have died in such a fashion. But I suppose let's take it back to, would you recommend this podcast? But you know what? Sorry, before we go into that, we haven't discussed the hosts. Do you hate them?
What do you think about the hosts?
You usually have a lot to say. Well, I thought they were great. I didn't love episode 2 because I thought it went too gruesome. I do think if they were producing this podcast now, they wouldn't go so gruesome. I think a lot of the things that were mentioned were unnecessary. I thought the part about like the manufacturing of the chute and the way they produced all that, I thought that was good. But yeah, I will say I do think they've kept Phoebe front and center.
Yeah, I think it was very respectful. I think I appreciated the inclusion of the song by one of Phoebe's friends, which was very sad, but I thought was a nice way.
That whole episode was very sad.
It was, but then they came back to it in the final episode, the final full episode, and let kind of the song play through a while, which I thought was a nice way to end. So I think in terms of being respectful to the victim's family, I think they gave the victim's family lots of space to talk, which was good. I think sort of stepping back from this podcast, I said this in the preview, like this is the type of story that I'm sort of reluctant to go into. I think after listening to the first episode, there's a mystery here, and I was really interested in the mystery of it. And I was definitely engaged throughout. I think I would recommend it with sort of notes of caution about the type of story it is, the gruesomeness of it. You can't get away from that. What about you?
Yeah, I would recommend it to people. I thought it was really infuriatingly fascinating.
Do you think it aged well?
I think there are numerous things in it that they wouldn't do today. I think some of the commentary from certain people close to Phoebe has not aged well.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I think generally, like it's a mystery. It's a hard to understand story about. We don't know what really happened, and I think this is a nice sort of investigation. Like I think it's a fascinating investigation into a really challenging and frustrating mystery.
Yeah, it's just rare. Well, it's pretty rare that you hear police fucking up this badly.
Yeah, this is pretty bad.
It's real bad. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to join us on Patreon, patreon.com. So much crime, so little time. You'll get early access to future shows, bonus content, and you'll also support us in making this show. Jeff?
Yes?
Want to go to Georgia? Not the country, the state.
Sure.
Want to go to a little tiny town called Noble in Georgia?
Okay.
I don't know if I want to go there because apparently in the winter of 2002, more than 300 bodies were found on one property in Noble, Georgia. And that's what we're going to discuss on the next So Much Crime,
So Little Time. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of Mind Glove Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Our theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show on your podcast app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.